There are dire warnings that New South Wales will be hit by increasingly extreme weather.
2015 was the hottest year since climate records began.
Figures show this July was the single hottest month in recorded history.
Australia sweltered through its hottest spring on record.
Climate change is now affecting every country on every continent.
It's the rate that's of great concern.
And what do you put that rate down to?
Oh, it's human activity.
We have everything we need. Some still doubt that we have the will to act, but I say the will to act is itself a renewable resource.
Hello and welcome to this week's episode of Climactic. My name's Eve and I'm coming to you from Gadigal Land. Today I'm sharing with you an idea that is one of the three things that has stopped me from doom scrolling in the last lockdown. The number one is the subreddit Witches versus the Patriarchy. Number two is watching DIY videos of things I'm never going to make. And number three is Solarpunk. Solarpunk is an art and political movement that basically imagines and then strives to implement not just, a stable atmospheric level of carbon dioxide, but the abolition and transformation of the systems that allowed something like climate change to arise. This is an episode of The Fire These Times with Joey Ayub and Andrew, also known as Saint Drew on YouTube. I've put all the show notes so that you can find them. They have a wonderful discussion and are both really great at talking about how we can create a better and more livable world for everyone. So let's get on with the show.
Welcome to The Fire These Times, the podcast bringing you conversations at the intersection of politics, culture, and the environment. I'm your host, Joey Ayub, and today we'll be talking to Andrew. Andrew identifies as a solarpunk anarchist from Trinidad and Tobago, and he's behind the YouTube channel St. Andrewism. I wanted to have Andrew on to talk primarily about solarpunk. Now, solarpunk is defined as an art movement that envisions how the future might look if humanity succeeded in solving major contemporary challenges, especially climate change and pollution. It's something that I've been getting into much more recently, and I have quite a number of exciting projects and plans and a number of other fun stuff that I won't get into right now because I want to focus on Andrew. As I mentioned, he has this YouTube channel called St. Andrewism. And on that channel, he tackles topics such as what is solarpunk, the climate movement is broken, why revolution is therapy, an open letter to Gen Z, carnival and class struggle, and so on and so forth. And we managed to discuss quite a number of them in this episode. So I won't take too much of your time. I'll just say that this will be the first of hopefully many episodes on solarpunk. I'll try and find ways to always keep it entertaining and informative and not just indulge in my geeky obsession with it. And yeah, I think that's it. So that's today's episode. This episode was first published for monthly Patreon supporters. To become a monthly Patreon supporter, please head out to patreon.com/firethesetimes or check the website for other methods. If you cannot donate, you can still support this project by sharing with your friends and family and leaving a review on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or wherever you get your podcasts. The music of this podcast is by Torabit. Thank you for listening and take care.
My name is Andrew. I'm an Afro-Trinidadian writer, artist, and solarpunk anarchist. I run a YouTube channel called St. Andrewism, and I also blog.
I first discovered your channel after getting interested or re-interested in solarpunk, and you have this great video on solarpunk, and I had this conversation with Emmy Bevancy, and in the end of my episodes, I usually ask for book recommendations and stuff, and they recommended as just the genre in general of solarpunk and Afrofuturism as well, for that matter. So for those who don't know, would you mind just telling listeners what solarpunk is and how did you yourself start getting interested in it?
Oh, well, that's something I could talk about all day, honestly. I don't exactly know when I first heard about it. I might have been on Tumblr or DeviantArt, but I just remember when I did find it, I got hooked very quickly, it's like, give me all the art you can get, It's really, solarpunk is kind of a fusion of art and politics, although it's primarily art. It starts to shift more towards politics the more you dive into it. It's a bit of a literary genre as well because it derives from the whole cyberpunk thing. and it influences different media as well. Well, retroactively, I suppose, because people often reference the Miyazaki movies like Spirited Away and Castle in the Sky as potential examples of solarpunk. And of course, Ursula K. Le Guin's books like The Dispossessed. But yeah, it's a vision for the future that's based on sustainability and autonomy and social justice. So it's path it's that also praxis. So like I said, it kind of started with arts, but it quickly moved to like community and getting into a relationship with the earth and with the land, and a lot of various stripes of socialists also kind of adopted it to fill in the gaps and the pitfalls of the modern environmentalist movement, sort of rethink our approach to sort of things.
Yeah, I'm just really enjoying the fact that a disproportionate number of book recommendations that I've also, like the ones I mentioned, I asked guests to have at the end of episodes, which we'll do as well. Two of them mentioned The Dispossessed, and one of them mentioned Solarpunk, and I think another one mentioned also Afrofuturism. And yeah, I don't know. I guess it's something. It sort of says who I'm looking to, who I'm actually inviting, such as yourself, and it's something that I'm definitely trying to get into more, because it tries anyway. I mean, as you said, it's relatively new. It's been mostly art, even though now there's a bit more politics to it as well. But it sort of attempts anyway to provide an alternative to our usual doom and gloom, without being in denial of the seriousness of the challenges ahead, obviously.
Although I would say that some aspects of the solarpunk movement do fall into the trap of greenwashing. That tends to happen with folks who are now getting into it, and so they haven't really interrogated those assumptions and stuff. But if you go on, like, for example, Reddit has a solarpunk community. People in the comments, when they do see greenwashing, they will usually call it out. And for those who don't know, greenwashing is when you give architecture or products or whatever the case may be the veneer of being, environmentally friendly and whatnot, when it actually is. So, that is an issue that does exist among sort of newbie solarpunks, but it's an issue that's being addressed.
Absolutely. Thanks for that as well. And so, like, you introduced it pretty well. And so linked to Solarpunk, which you also mentioned briefly, is like the idea that the way we talk about the climate and climate change and the climate emergency and all of that, the climate crisis, is pretty broken. Not just in the sense of like not thinking of alternatives to capitalism as frequently as we should be doing by now, but also in the sense that the climate movement itself, at least the most vocal one, has only fairly recently started taking seriously matters such as social justice, indigenous rights, environmental racism, and so on and so forth. I know this, even as I say this, is a bit contentious because, you can easily argue, well, that's a specific climate movement in the West, which is more than fair enough, but it has dominated
Sure, because they have the social capital and media influence to sort of permeate.
So what's your argument as to for why the climate movement as of now has been broken, and how do you see the latest trend, let's say, compared to the older ones, if that makes sense?
So I'm going to be responding to the first question first with the issues of the environmentalist movement. And my issues of the environmentalist movement also sort of apply to people who I would say should know better, people on the so-called left. And that is, I think people are a bit lacking in their material analysis of what's going on with climate change. There's a recognition that climate change exists. I don't think people are like really diving into to materially sort of analyze what is happening, because it's happening right now across the world. Climate collapse is occurring, but people don't really understand it in all the complexities. A lot of people believe that it can be reformed away, or even that it can be revolutioned away for those who go that way, that route. But I think there isn't enough emphasis placed on the fact that a lot of those tipping points have already been tipped, and our task is addressing those and preparing for the consequences of those. and adjusting our sort of vision for the future in a more realist light. Like, we may not be able to make it to space, we may be able to suggest, after a long arduous process, renew our relationship with the earth rather than continuing to destroy it. A lot of people, I think, believe that we're going to be able to maintain certain lifestyles despite the climate collapse, when so much of the way we live, is predicated on the destruction of the earth. And basically, to put a long story short, I think people don't grasp how deep the issue is and how radically things are going to need to change. And could you repeat the second question?
Sure. I think it's fair to say, anyway, that there has been a growing awareness or trend or whatever we want to call it within that movement, broadly speaking, especially with like younger folks, Gen Zers, I would say, that, applying a more intersectional lens to the issue. Although I do think that fundamentally, I do agree with what you just said, that there's also there's still a sense that we can, quote unquote, stop it rather than we can reduce its impact and we can make it less deadly as opposed to what we're currently still doing. But there is a problem with the notion that we're just, it's just a matter of changing policy today and therefore it's going to stop it. Putting that aside, there is definitely a growing sense that, at least from my standpoint, from what I can tell, that matters such as like social justice, indigenous rights, even like environmental racism, these things are at least slightly more addressed within the younger side of the climate movement than something that I had ever seen before, for that matter, if that makes sense.
Yeah. At least that's starting to build. Of course, there's still some elements of ignorance and whatnot, but I do what I can, and people do what they can to sort of raise that awareness of what's going on. Because the wisdom that exists in indigenous cultures and their relationships to the land is wisdom that we are going to need to apply, If we are going to look to technocratic geoengineering solutions, they're not going to save the day. In fact, they could quite potentially make things worse. We're going to have to look at how we can sort of scale back our lifestyles, learn from, an intersectional lens, learn from these cultures, how we can best relate with the environment in a more sustainable and healthy way, and how we could design our lives and our society in a more healthy way.
Yeah, it's actually something that I did a couple of episodes. One is upcoming, one already came out. So the first one was on how to limit global warming to 1.5 degrees Celsius. And it's this scenario, like a societal transformation scenario, as they called it, by Kuikenham and Linda Schneider. They were two of the co-authors of that paper. And the idea really is that the consequences are here with us already, but they would likely not impact. We know this for a fact that they would not impact everyone in the same way, at least not in the short term.
Yeah,
in the long term, it's a bit less understood. And I can tell you, like, from a small parenthesis, that as from as someone who lives in Switzerland, I can definitely say that many people, probably most people, still don't think that this is going to affect them directly, even though maybe the rational part of, like, they may know it intellectually, but not in any deep way, let's say.
Yeah. I think that's something that's definitely an issue. There's sort of a disconnect between, what is, the facts, and people's, I guess, emotional reckoning with what is.
Yeah, definitely. Recently, there was a national vote on whether to have a trade deal with Indonesia, which was being opposed by, among other things, environmentalists pointing to the devastating palm oil plantations in Indonesia. And most people still voted to allow that trade deal, because at the end of the day, when everything is about, quote unquote, the economy, this is something that, okay, I'll just say it this way because it's a frustration of mine. It's something that's a recurring theme even on this podcast. What we call the economy, what we call like basic models of economics, tend to not take into account any other economics other than what you might call either neoliberalism or even like old school capitalism. And it's something that you can really see in the way the attitude from the Swiss government towards even the pandemic. It only took now, and I think actually we're recording this on March 13th, and basically in a couple of days is when testing will be available and free in Switzerland. So that's an entire year into the pandemic.
Seriously?
Yeah.
Wait, so testing is now opening up in Switzerland?
Yeah, now it's accessible. Before you could do it by, if you have insurance, the insurance will cover it. But
I see.
Before that, and that was a recent thing, I think as of November 2020. Before that, you can only get testing if you had actual symptoms. So there was no preventative measure really. Switzerland, it's a big case study now as to how not to do things, and that's
right.
I think.
I mean, locally we had free access to testing.
Yeah,
so that's quite shocking to me.
Well, yeah, I think it's shocking to many people. Unfortunately, I don't know if it will be shocking to people who live here. Unfortunately, it's just a big problem. So I'm trying not to rant too much about it, but it's something that for me just symbolizes just that, and how people tend to vote. It is changing with the younger generation as well. That there's a very clear generational trend, very similar to stuff in the UK or France or other places in Europe. But the way people vote tends to really be what you might call business first sort of mentality. And so I kind of went on a tangent there. Sorry, but part of all of this, I guess what I'm considering at the root of this frustration, other than a necessary materialist analysis or whatever, is just this lack of imagination, or this lack even of imaginary, I should say, as to what could be counted, or alternatives that we can think about to our current predicament, even though we are going through a pandemic. And part of this, I hope this is not too awkward of a transition, but part of this imagining / creating a different future, inevitably requires us to deal with ourselves. And I don't just mean this in a surface level, be the change you want to see in the world kind of thing, which is fine if it's taken seriously, but often it's not. But rather acknowledging, I guess I'm just acknowledging that we may bring baggage, if you see what I mean, to revolutionary settings, which could do more damage than good. So let me just explain myself, if that's okay. I come from an activist background. I have almost a decade now of being on the streets, or following people who are on the streets, or friends of mine, or whatever. And it's just something that at some point becomes very obvious that in organizing spaces, for lack of a better term, or in activist spaces in general, there tends to be a lack of acknowledgement that we are entering a space, let's say, with baggage. We're coming with something in our past, or in our present for that matter. Concerns of ours, anxieties, what have you. When it's not recognized, I feel that can actually take over necessary work for kind of more long-term transformative work, if that makes sense. You have a few videos. One that I'm especially thinking of is why does the revolution need therapy? And I'm guessing we can sort of add to that the other videos that you have on the self-care being broken, which I think is a very similar argument to what I've been thinking of, or indeed your videos on dealing with stress, even philosophies of love. So I'll sort of throw them all back at you and ask, why do you think the revolution needs therapy?
Another topic I could really spend a lot of time talking about, which is
Go for it.
Sort of why I have a lot of videos about it. The psychological prison, I suppose, was a concept that I first heard of, but sort of intuitively understood from an anarchist writer and former Black Panther named Ashanti Alston. I'd read his pamphlet on it, The Psychological Dimension, Childhood and the Psychological Dimension of Revolution. And he speaks about how, we suppressed from our childhood and inculcated, or, sort of brainwashed into a sort of acceptance of our domination and sort of a paralyzation of our liberty. So he calls on people, and I concur, to ruthlessly question and criticize your base assumptions, to break out of these mindsets of capitalist realism, statist realism, workerism, patriarchy, ageisms, and all those all those assumptions and biases and modes of oppression that we sort of take for granted, that we may not be integrating. And we end up perpetuating in our praxis, perhaps different, under a different coat of paint or under different language, We still hold on to these attitudes and these gestures and these traditions that are actually feeding right back into the system, We end up losing sight of the world we want to create, and I think it's really sad. I've seen it happen again and again with revolutionaries, with historical figures, with activists who I know. I think it's very important to ruthlessly interrogate all that exists. To decondition yourself and to be open to constantly learning, not just from books, but from people and from people's experiences, and taking into your own experiences as well. And I definitely talk about this as well in dealing with stress, because we are so stressed and overworked. Everyone's working or out of jobs and things. So we lose our time and we lose our life. And we need to have an understanding of how that is affecting us, how that's affecting our attitudes. But at the same time, we can't individualize these solutions to stress, which is an issue I have with the whole self-care industry. It's very hyper-consumerist, and it really individualizes care. When what I advocate for is, solidarity, support groups, stronger bonds, stronger love, community, mutual aid. And I have a video on mutual aid coming out later this month. It's the 15th of March right now. It should be coming out on the 24th. So you look out for that. But, I want people to realize that we can't look at individual or small-scale solutions to these. We have to look at it as sort of a community, look at it through a community lens, And I'm reminded of the work of bell hooks, who I do not reference enough in my videos. I have referenced her in a few, but her books, and especially her book All About Love, and another book which I would recommend later, they really undergird a lot of my work, and they really undergird a lot of my advocacy, because I'm a strong believer in love, as cliche as that may sound, in deep connections, and in shedding this competitiveness and shallowness and commodification that capitalism encourages in our relationships in favor of love and connection and care.
Yeah, thanks for that. I can only think of the many even much more, let's say, seasoned activists than myself in Lebanon that have ended up being burnt out and unable to really function, either sacrificing personal relationships for quote unquote the cause, or taking that baggage to the cause and actually harming the cause, putting the cause in quotations. But this is something that is often not thought about. I think there's definitely in the wake of the Me Too movement and everything, there's a growing appreciation for that. I can definitely say that a lot more of these, let's say, patriarchal the legacies of patriarchy and the ongoing effects of it, I think that's being more challenged than something that I've at least, as I said, I've been doing this for 10 years now. I can definitely say that in the past 3 years, 4 years, it's been happening more frequently than before. So I guess that's definitely a positive sign. But it is also part of that is I look at what's happening now, right now in Lebanon, and I sort of see a lot of difficulties, or at least from my standpoint, my interpretation of this. Other people might disagree, but a lot of people are unable to form bonds with one another despite the crisis that we see beyond sort of your immediate family and that sort of thing. I'm not saying this doesn't happen. We know of stories where you have communities that are sort of helping one another and all of that, but you also have a lot of instances where you would just have a small shop owner who doesn't make ends meet either, being attacked or yelled at by people who are starving, whereas the bankers and the politicians and all of those guys are totally fine. And it's just one of those things that it's not just that. So I hope listeners don't get me wrong. I'm not blaming anyone here other than the bankers and the politicians, obviously. I'm not saying that, you know, the person yelling or the person being yelled at are different. And I'm actually saying the opposite in this specific example. They're both kind of being screwed over.
Yeah.
But there is a resistance, I guess, or at least a hesitancy towards opening up these spaces towards something that's more anti-patriarchal or feminist or whatever. We've definitely seen them since 2019, a bit more of those. But I'm sure feminist activists in Beirut, you know, would notice even more than me right now because I'm not there anymore. But it's something that they had to struggle with quite a lot to make that space, to create that space. And so I guess the question that I had, and the reason why I asked you this, like the importance of therapy in revolutionary settings and why the revolution needs therapy, to put it that way, is really that if this was a revolution and an uprising for justice, then it is only basic that this would include feminism, for example. And the fact that it's something that needs to be added, it's something that feminists need to actually struggle to make it possible. Not even as like one of the dominant demands, let's say, but, you know, so to just make it to the point where it's sort of accepted or tolerated.
Yeah, there's some serious barriers
yes,
that exist there. And I think what a lot of people don't realize, a lot of men don't realize, is as long as those barriers exist, you know, neither party is going to be able to live fully and fulfillingly. There's not going to be liberation without women's liberation, you know?
Yeah, absolutely. I had an episode on a similar topic on actually. So there's an episode I did, episode 27 with Chuck Derry. He's this American. Actually, don't know what his job is, but he works with the Gender Violence Institute. And the episode was about this essay that he wrote on the risks of psychologizing patriarchal oppression. And like that's the title. And the argument that he was making, which I largely agreed with, I think we could have taken it a bit further, but didn't have much time, was that a lot of the time we simply say that someone who is, like a man who is violent against a woman is just doing so because that man is not feeling okay or whatever, you know, kind of whitewashing it. And his argument was that it's not just that, but it's also because the man gets away with it most of the time because we live in a society where it's simply taken for granted. Of course, this changes from society to society. And as I said, there seems to be, thankfully, like less tolerance towards at least the most obvious forms of violence, which tend to be the most immediate ones, obviously. But yeah, I guess I'm still a bit wary of the fact that it's not taken for granted that a revolution needs to be feminist, for example. It's just not taken for granted that this isn't the starting point, if you see what I mean. This is something that needs to be fought for by a subgroup of the activists in general to convince the other activists that this is something that needs to be addressed at a wider level, if that makes sense. And this is something that I definitely, I'm still pretty frustrated by. And like, you know, I'm a cis straight dude, so I'm not the one bearing the brunt of it anyway, but yeah.
Right.
I guess another like sort of angle to this, actually, no, let me just ask you if that's okay to sort of expand on the mutual aid aspect to this. It's an upcoming video, so we can take advantage of that. How does it relate to a different way of thinking of self-care, for example?
Well, I definitely believe that our self-care needs to expand beyond the self, you know. But I definitely don't think that you should just dump your traumas on other people or whatever. I do believe that your therapy, quote unquote, is not complete without integrating community and your social bonds and your friendships and whatnot. We are social creatures, and as such, we can't do this alone, you know, and that's a trick that capitalism plays in our mind, you know, that we are these atomized individuals and that ultimately we are all that we have and whatever, when the opposite is the case, you know, we are incomplete with our community. I don't mean that in the sense of a sort of a hive mind kind of thing. I just mean in the sense of what is the individual without the community, and what is the community without the individual, you know?
Yeah, I definitely agree with that as well. Amy Bevancy, previous guest, had this like group in which they basically practice what they call like emotional anarchism. And the idea behind that is actually pretty similar to what you just mentioned. I mean, it's the same thing. It's putting mutual aid in practice and looking at ways of, without like sort of denying one's individuality, of course, seeing or exploring anyway how we interrelate with one another in a way that is usually, as I said, like not it's usually not recognized in settings that, you know, from the so-called left or whatever, that should anyway, or one would think more like obvious by now.
Yeah, I think as you're on that topic, I think we should all, and it's something I'm planning on doing within the next couple of weeks, take a moment to log off, you know. It's sort of a meme, but we all need to take a break from time to time. I've been sort of plugged into politics and stuff, even before I started my YouTube channel. But it's been kind of non-stop since I started my YouTube channel. And so I definitely want to take a break. I'm a couple of videos ahead in terms of writing my scripts and producing it and everything. I think I'm just going to take a moment to sort of, you know, literally log off and take a step back, you know, touch some grass, paint the painting, you know.
Yeah, amen to that. It's something that I was sort of forced on me in some ways by the pandemic. I was already hyper online before, but then with the pandemic, it became even more, more of a problem. And I had to force myself, essentially, to take step backs semi-regularly at this point. So I guess, sorry, since you brought this up, because this is something that I think is related to like what we might call like proper self-care. And it's something that I guess, okay, I don't know if this is accurate, but I guess more people know about this now with the pandemic. There's just been more think pieces and whatever at least from what I've noticed, or maybe, I guess. But the reason why I started thinking that way, at least in the past year or so, is that I've become very frustrated by seeing, or at the fact that I've seen a lot of people that I know, like either acquaintances or actually some close friends, act in certain ways online that I know is not them, if that makes sense. I know that it's so more like the persona they have online taking over. And the only solution to that is actually logging off and taking time off and rethinking certain things and priorities, blah, blah, blah. But it can be very easy to forget that if you're hyper online and if you're really following like the daily grind of I don't know how one would describe it, but this, you know, what Silicon Valley calls engagement, and
it's
all
like,
of that.
It's almost like drugs, you know. They have us like lab rats, hooked on these things. I mean, it's habits I'm still like struggling to break. Like I've tried to set this rule for myself where, you know, I don't jump onto Twitter until after lunchtime, that sort of thing, you know, because it's very easy to, you know, literally jump from social media to social media as soon as you wake up. You know, you check Twitter, you check Reddit, you check Instagram, you check WhatsApp, you check so on and so forth. You know, it's a drain on your time, and this doesn't help anybody. You know, all the best work that you're doing, that you will be doing, and even beyond work. So I don't want to talk about work too much, but a lot of the best moments of our life, well, all the best moments of our life will not be, scrolling through Twitter. It'll be, connecting with our loved ones. And if we could sort of focus on that rather than arguing with first name punchy numbers on twitter.com, we'd be better off for it,
I agree with that. And I've been, I've mentioned, I almost deleted Twitter a few months ago. Now, unfortunately, I have to keep it for work. And what I'm trying to I'm trying to find a way to build a more long-term alternative. It's really not easy. Network effects are a real thing and they're a big problem. But yeah, on that topic, I would just say that I would definitely have a lot of episodes on this because it's something that I'm still trying to think through and to go through. And I go through these experiments, basically is what I call them. I go through I tell myself, well, between this time and that time, I won't do this, or I will have I don't check anything in the morning. That's actually sacrosanct by now. I wake up at 5 a.m. and I just don't check anything before it's 8 or 9. And even after that, I tend to try anyway. I'm not saying I do this perfectly, but I try to just stick to what I want to do and what I feel is productive and useful and even pleasurable, I guess I would say as well, what is actually interesting to go through. And I feel like this is like Solarpunk, it's something that I feel is interesting to go through, but it's not something that I can do a deep dive, let alone actually contribute to it, write about it, talk about it, whatever.
Yeah.
Without a step back in some ways sometimes.
Yeah, that's another thing, right? We do, sort of an earlier point you're making, we do make mistakes, right? In terms of trying to set these rules for ourselves when it comes to social media and, technology as a whole. We make mistakes and, I think it's very important, just as an aside, to forgive ourselves for those mistakes and to just be willing to, adapt and move forward rather than being like, damn, I broke my rule, I feel terrible, let me keep scrolling,
Yes, absolutely. And that's what I guess I would just emphasize that I have had and I still have some rules, but I break them a lot. And it makes more sense to me to keep them anyway and to sort of work on them and see which ones work and which ones don't.
Yeah, don't give up,
Exactly. Then spending too much time just feeling guilty that I just broke my own rule or whatever. And I say this, I started doing that. In the beginning, it was actually all self-guilt tripping and whatever. It just got to the point where that wasn't even working, to be honest. So I was just looking at different ways of dealing with that big problem and the frustration that I mentioned earlier on, that it's not more understood. It's definitely a lot of people know that there is a problem with social media and with technology, vaguely speaking, but the way we interact with it and the way it has already shaped us in ways that I feel we don't fully recognize, especially in the past decade, is something that I'm trying to let's say deconstruct in my own life, and for the end goal being also to be able to help others deconstruct it, because it's such a big and overwhelming problem, and network effects especially mean that it's almost impossible for many people to get their news from anywhere else or to be connected to other people in this very, very basic way, even pre-pandemic, So I'll kind of end that, close that parenthesis in some way, a very long one. But I wanted us to sort of go back into maybe more local context, specifically on Trinidad and Tobago. I haven't had any episodes so far on Trinidad and Tobago. I would assume that the audience or the listeners may know a bit, but probably not much. But the topics that we're discussing, are in many ways global, but I would be curious if you sort of can bring up your own Trimbagonian background. At the risk of sounding too vague, how has that impacted your politics? What are sort of some specificity, let's say, to your own context that you feel would be relevant here?
Yeah, I was born and raised on the island of Trinidad, and occasionally visiting Tobago for vacation. So I know a little bit less about their unique tensions. But there are definitely a lot of groups and interests that are at play on our, relatively tiny island, which a lot of people may not consider, they might just see, oh, it's probably just, like all the other Caribbean islands, just probably a bunch of black people or whatever. But we have quite the mixed bag. We have a very, unfortunately, very small indigenous community due to how the colonists ravaged the island with disease and whatnot and overworking. It's a very, very small community, and they are basically marginalized out of existence. They are not really discussed, they're not acknowledged, they're just kind of there. And lots of them are pretty much integrated into the mainstream culture, so their unique issues aren't really discussed. There are, of course, also the local whites, when they rolled in the Spanish, the French, and the English. Probably all speak English now. And, they ruled for a solid couple hundred years. And up to this day, they still influence our politics. They still profit from our industry, and they still maintain strong ties with our former colonizers, the UK especially. Apart from the colonizers, they of course brought in African slaves, of whom I am descended. I'm not very far descended from slaves. My great-great-grandmother passed just after I was born, and she was raised by a slave, so it really wasn't that long ago.
Yeah.
And after the abolition of slavery, the Indian, and as an East Indian, and the Chinese indentured laborers were brought over by the British, and so they ended up coming to work the fields, and of course, the ruling class, doing what the ruling class does, sort of fomented those tensions between the Africans and the Indians. The Chinese were actually always a pretty small minority compared to the Africans and the Indians. Not as many Chinese had come over because it was mostly Chinese men who would come over, whereas the Indians, usually it was whole families that came over. But of course, there were a couple more waves of immigration, especially after the Cultural Revolution and stuff, and they still play a role in our economy, and they still have connections with mainland China, and that plays a role in our politics. We recently opened up a Chinatown in Port of Spain, donated by the Chinese government. In addition to those groups, there's also the Lebanese and Syrian communities. They came just before the dissolution of the Ottoman Empire. They were mostly Christians. They sort of fell in with the Roman Catholic Church, and they brought textiles and whatnot. So they amassed a lot of wealth, and now they are in a fairly elite position in society. They are basically seen as white in Trinidad. And most recently, of course, there have been small communities from West Africa and the Philippines and whatnot that have come to Trinidad as well, but they are fairly small. Most recently, there's been a massive wave of Venezuelan migration because, for those who don't know, Trinidad is like on the same continental plate as Venezuela and the rest of South America. So we actually have a very small body of water between us and Venezuela. Mm-hmm. So we've had, I think it was, actual numbers aren't known because obviously most of them came over illegally, but it estimated that somewhere around, I believe it was 100,000 have come over, somewhere between 50 to 100,000. And considering we're an island of 1.3 million as of the last census in 2011, that's going to have a major impact as well. We're already seeing the sort of tensions that are rising, the xenophobia and stuff that's growing out of that. And of course, growing up, it's very easy to see the impact of colonialism on how it has shaped our nation. I mean, I myself, my mind was colonized pretty extensively because that's what it means to be a colonized subject. But as I grew up, I grew out of it and learned and expanded my understanding of our situation. And you really see colonialism at play today. A lot of people in Trinidad don't recognize it or don't have the words to describe it. But it's very clear that we have not come that far from the extreme class divides and divisions and government corruption and racism and colorism and all those things that were developed in the colonial era. Most glaringly, of course, being classism, because a large part of the national conversation centers around the education system, because we have retained a lot of the colonial aspects of it. We have the gender segregation still in a lot of the schools. We have the class divides between the prestige schools and the government schools, the prestige schools being run by religious boards usually. We have, of course, entrance exams. So we have an entrance exam from primary school to secondary school. We have an exam after the end of secondary school. We have an exam after the end of post-secondary school, which is lower and upper six. We have a lot of barriers, basically. So tutoring and lessons play a big role in the education system. A lot of times teachers in the school get the chance to teach everything, and there's a reliance on tutors to fill in those gaps. Of course, there are vast disparities in terms of access to resources between the government schools and the prestige schools, so that really affects people's opportunities. And so if people can't afford, lessons or tutoring, they really get the short end of the stick, And there's also a staggering lack of class consciousness. There's the whole notion of, black capitalism or capitalism coming to save the day. There's, of course, the imported homophobia and queerphobia as a whole that came from the British Empire, all those ancient laws that we are only now starting to overthrow. And of course, very significantly, there's like a serious crime problem. But because of our location, compared to the rest of the Caribbean and right next to, South America, we are a hub of gun trafficking, human trafficking, sex trafficking, drug trafficking. And you really see that impact as well. There are gangs at play, usually though limited to their respective areas, but a lot of corruption and illicit wealth funnels through politics, and a lot of violence takes place against underprivileged communities and against women. In fact, there's recently been a wave of protests and demonstrations because a lot of women, for such a small island, a lot of women are going missing all the time, never to be heard from again. Or if they are heard from again, it's because they are, deceased. They're found in a ditch or they're found in a river, whatever the case may be. And so there's obviously organ trafficking and stuff going there as well. So it's like a lot going on what some may initially perceive as a tropical paradise, but we're dealing with a lot.
Yeah.
I went off in a bit of a tangent there, but
oh no, not at all. Thanks.
That's sort of a summary in our condition right
now. Yeah. No, thanks for that, and thanks a lot for also mentioning the Syrian Lebanese community as well. It's something that I definitely want to get into more. It's something that many people in Lebanon don't actually know much about, or in Syria. But I will hopefully dedicate more time to that. So, with everything you just said, and again, thanks for that. What might a Solarpunk anarchist growing up in Trinidad and Tobago, see or experience something? I don't know if that makes much sense. Maybe you will be repeating yourself. I don't know. But what see what I'm trying to get at? The specificity of your context. So okay, I'll explain that that by just mentioning my own background. Because I grew up in post-war Lebanon, I'm both like fine-tuned to like sectarian rhetoric, but at the same time, I, up until recently, was not fine-tuned to racism or classism or xenophobia or sexism, etc., because for the most part, these are not things that were dealt with in my environment, in my world, let's say.
Right.
It's something that I, unknowingly or knowingly, basically benefited from, just due to the structures that exist in post-war Lebanon. So, like, on the one hand, I could be fine-tuned to one thing, but less so to something else due to the specific nature of where I grew up and when I grew up. The two are very important. Like, you're a certain age, growing up in a certain context at a certain time, etc. Would you say that has affected your affection, let's say, towards solarpunk anarchism in any way, if that makes sense?
Yeah, I mean, we definitely have a lot of, being on an island, of course, there's that consciousness of the looming threat of climate collapse. Although, like, compared to other Caribbean islands, we tend to escape, like, the intense hurricanes and stuff, because the path of the hurricanes tends to avoid us entirely. We still do face, tropical storms and depressions, and people's homes get flooded, and landslides, and even right now, we're supposed to be in the dry season, and the rain has been basically pouring nonstop for like 2 days now. And so there's definitely that aspect of it. The very clear impacts of climate and climate collapse on our daily lives. I also see the failure of our infrastructure to respond to that, like the way our city, our capital city and stuff, Port Spain has been designed. It can't really respond to that. Not just the infrastructure, but also the sort of structure of politics and whatnot, how incapable our government, as a global South nation's government, has been to respond to this, and the way that they profit off of the continued corruption and continued extractivism that's taking place. And that's something I neglected to mention earlier. Trinidad is actually very oil rich. So as a result, we have a lot of oil companies and gas companies influencing our politics and extracting our resources. And we are about to see the tail end of that, the consequences of that, because inevitably reserves dry up and the coffers run bare. In fact, we have a bit of a US dollar crisis in the country because we lack that currency at the moment. But yeah, having all those sort of financial and political tensions at play growing up, seeing classism at play as well, racism at play as well, those have all like influenced my perception of hierarchy and my perception of how we can address, the climate crisis. Seeing as well how, businesses and religious groups have, influenced our education, our politics and whatnot. Seeing people fleeing the island, sort of a brain drain taking place, the inefficacy of our bureaucracy to sort of account for the wealth of potential that exists in our people, what those have influenced, my perception, as well as seeing the disdain that people tend to have for both major political parties, the PNM and UNC. That has also influenced things, because it's very clear that no matter who's in charge, there's corruption taking place either way. And yeah, I mean, on a less sour note, we have some great culture, great music, great arts, great food, great festivals. And that also has influenced my politics to some extent, because I just imagine all the people, all the creative people that are on this island who could do so much more if not for the structure of our society and the damage that capitalism, like the damage that capitalism inflicts on our country. So it's, it's a bit of a mixed bag. I love it here though.
I guess I asked it to always try and have both like local and global perspective at the same time, have both of them sort of interplay with one another. One thing that I feel is often missed out whenever you have two people, let's say like two anarchists, speaking to one another or whatever, is of course like, you know, there might be this appeal to some larger ism or some larger vision of the world or whatever, but it tends to, in my view anyway, it tends to be like, so basically what I'm trying to say is that when we don't mention the specific context or like the specificities of our own experiences, our own lived experiences, I guess, it can like we can just miss out on a lot of things. So like a lot of what you just mentioned right now is very informative, not just in terms of like just knowing a bit more on Trinidad and Tobago, but it sort of tells me certain things that I may not have known, let's say, otherwise, if that makes sense. It's the reason why I tend to sometimes go back anyway to like Lebanon, growing up there, emphasizing that there are certain things that happened in that time that I grew up there, basically the past 2 decades and a half.
I agree completely, and I appreciate that. The focus as well, not just on the global.
Exactly, yeah. So like back to the videos, you have a number of them, like I mentioned before, that are like youth oriented, and there's one called like A Letter to Gen Zers, and another one on, I think it's called Why It Sucks to Be Young. Can you just like, as you know, with as much detail as you want, really explain why the need to have these videos that are specifically targeted at Gen Zers, let's say?
I think, well, I've noticed rather that as time has passed, you know, I got on the internet when I was like 8 or 9 years old, and I've been on it ever since. And I've seen, you know, the conversation was around millennials for a while, and now I'm seeing conversation moving to Gen Z, you know, as millennials have aged and Gen Z has aged. I find it particularly important to focus on Gen Z because, and at risk of generalizing, I would say we are progressive and we are conscious of the climate crisis, but a lot of people in my generation have no idea what to do about it. You know, the dominant narrative is shifting away from this, but is also to some extent still, you know, vote or, you know, reform, whatever the case may be. Even those who are vaguely anti-capitalist still fall into that. And so I try to address Gen Z specifically because, you know, speaking Gen Z to Gen Z, you know, we have these anxieties. I mean, thinking at the time that we grew up in, you know, we had the 2008 crisis, we had the financial crisis, we've had several, you know, wars breaking out in various parts of the world, though different people have been affected very differently. You know, we've had refugee crises, we've had, you know, now this pandemic, and of course the time lapse, and, you know, housing crises and all those different things. And basically it's kind of worrying, you know. I try not to think too much. I think about the future a lot. That's sort of what I'm building towards, but I try not to think too much about my personal future because it's very easy to spiral that way, you know, because you never know what really will take place. You know, who could have predicted that a pandemic would break out in 2020? And now here we are. So I try not to worry too much about my personal future, just taking it, you know, one day at a time, 1 week at a time, 1 month at a time. But I want to address Gen Z because I know the feeling that a lot of us are feeling, and I want to do what I can about it.
Yeah, thanks for that. I'm trying to have a dimension of this podcast being about addressing or talking to Gen Zers, but, you know, I'm a millennial, so there will be limitations to that. In the context of Lebanon specifically, there is the fact that right now Gen Zers would have witnessed the first proper uprising, I would say, in our modern history. We did have one in 2015 that wasn't as large as the 2019 one and everything since then. And so I think basically many millennials, so like just thinking of the activists that I know and organizers that are more active than I am and still are, you know, we went through certain specific challenges and obstacles and whatever in the past decade that I feel could easily be, like the mistakes that we've made could easily be reproduced and remade time and time again, because the structure is in place to sort of like simplify it a bit. But the structures in place encourage these specific narrow-minded priorities. So like one obvious one for me is the fact that whenever you have uprisings in Lebanon, well, you didn't have that many, but like at least the most recent one, for the most part, there is a complete, I guess you might call it like invisibilization of like Syrians and Palestinians and migrant domestic workers who are like from the Philippines and Ethiopia and Sri Lanka and other places. They tend to not be included in demands on the streets or in protests, or if they do participate, which is not common, they would do so without sort of making themselves too visible, if that makes sense. Right. And this is something that I feel is still an ongoing mistake and a weakness in the otherwise like revolutionary momentum and movement and everything. And I do want the ones coming after us, so like people who are now turning, I don't know, 17, 18, whatever, starting uni is usually how we like university is usually how we look at it in Lebanon. Not to have to also go through this entire exact same mistakes for the next decade. And that's something that I'm personally trying to tackle more directly than I feel people should have done when I was going through it a decade ago.
Yeah, I think a mistake that a lot of movements make is not learning from the mistakes of the past. You know, people are either ignorant of them, or they villainize or misunderstand past movements, or they co-opt and water down past movements, or they idealize past movements. You know, it's not sort of a nuanced perspective on these movements of the past, what mistakes they made, what was effective, what wasn't. What did it achieve? What achievements ended up being failures in the long run? Like what looked like successes at first and ended up being a failure. Like these sort of like, post-analysis of movements can really help future movements. And a lot of my, one of my videos is coming out at the end of this month on the 31st. That actually is going to go quite deeply into like some of the past movements that have occurred and the mistakes that they have made, particularly related to the question of nonviolence and the role that nonviolence has played in movements. And so that's as much as I'll reveal for now, but that's something that really frustrates me, the lack of openness to and desire to learn from the mistakes of the past and the successes of the past and move forward with those. I mean, I guess because people have been taught it's different everywhere, but I think generally speaking, people have been taught a very liberalized version of history, a very sanitized version of history. And so I think it's important, whatever movements, whatever uprisings, as radicals, I suppose, as anarchists, as socialists, to bring that nuanced, far-reaching, complex sort of perspective. Even if the movement you're part of or the group you're part of doesn't end up identifying with necessarily your political label, having that label's voice in the movement can help to avoid certain pitfalls. And I think once you're friendly about it, you show people, of course, different uprisings have very different situations. I'm assuming a sort of a mellow level of tension, when dialogue is taking place, try to bring up mistakes that were made in the past so people don't end up repeating the same errors.
Yeah, absolutely. And for me, it's actually a crucial component of thinking about different futures. I guess, again, the experience of Lebanon for me is a situation where, of course, in retrospect, and like I'm doing my PhD on something very similar, so I tend to think about this a lot now. But the lack of an understanding of the past, because in Lebanon the past is actually taboo. Due to the civil war, because the civil war ended on the agreement, the Ta'if agreement that ended the civil war, ended with an amnesty law, which basically allowed all of the warlords to come out of it like with no consequences on them. And what that ended up doing is like they just got in power. So that their current government is still them for the most part. And that's like 3 decades on. The president, the speaker of parliament, both of them are in their 80s and they were former warlords during the war, just to name 2 examples, but many of the others as well. And so there is, you can easily see why there's no incentive really to have any kind of reckoning with the past and with the crimes that were committed and the violence and the trauma and all of that. And in fact, I think it was the exact opposite that happened. In the 90s, we were sold the idea that the only way forward is basically capitalism, the privatization of...
I heard, or at least I'd read, that Lebanon was considered the Switzerland of the Middle East.
Yes, and the reason for that is that before the Civil War, Lebanon had the laissez-faire, quote-unquote laissez-faire economy. So pretty market-oriented, or I shouldn't even say market-oriented, but a pretty business-oriented, pretty corporation-oriented economy. And that sort of continued on. Well, during the war, you had a war economy that ended up happening. But after the war, in the 1990s, you had the privatization of pretty much everything that was not destroyed during the war.
Like one of the key aspects of capitalism, the inclusion of the commons.
Exactly. So you had like the entire coast of Lebanon I think most of it is privatized, if not destroyed. You have, a lot of land reclamations to build new like hotels and, private marinas and that sort of thing. And the downtown of Beirut, which is historically known as El Balad, so like the country, which is a common Arab expression for downtowns usually in cities, is... it basically doesn't exist. It's just a company called Solidaire. So people I actually grew up saying we're going to Solidaire now. It's just something that became associated with the company. The location of this historical place became the company. And this is for me something that is specific about Lebanon, but at the same time is a global story. We just have it in a different proportion. I think we just have more of it. So we don't have any public spaces. We don't have these things that other countries do have to kind of soften the blow, if you want, of capitalism. Whereas in Lebanon, we didn't have that, something to soften the blow. And I think the only way I think many of my parents' generation, our parents' generation, balanced all of this out is to sort of have a de facto policy of not thinking too much about the past, other than maybe our immediate family past or whatever, but nothing that would imply or involve a wider community. And that, I think this is one of the barriers that the protests in Lebanon have by and large not managed to overcome, just because it's just so overwhelming. It's not easy. It's not something that's easy to tackle. With that in mind, this is a different pivot though because I want to go back a bit to Solarpunk. That's something that makes me, actually excited often, and it's something that I feel is very, very interesting. I'm a recent arrival to the world of Solarpunk, and I'm a recent arrival to even to Afrofuturism, even though I've known of Afrofuturism for some time now. But yeah, I haven't delved much into it that much yet, as much as I would like to anyway. But in your view, aren't there interesting intersections between Solarpunk and Afrofuturism?
Oh yeah, definitely. Solarpunk's aesthetics, they draw a lot from Asian and particularly Japanese styles, especially considering Solarpunk first came out to the cyberpunk genre. Right. But it definitely takes a lot from that sort of African influence as well. In fact, the Wakanda portrayed in Black Panther has been referenced often in Solarpunk circles as an element of a Solarpunk city design. It's not featured too heavily in the film, but you can see sort of, solar-powered tramways and walkable cities and, vertical gardening and things taking place.
Now that you mention it, it's very obvious. I didn't think about that.
Yeah. Yes, I think there's definitely that connection there between Afrofuturism and Solarpunk.
Awesome. Thanks for that. You have a cool video. So it's not directly related, but I wanted to bring it up anyway, on radical carnival. And so before asking you to just explain that video on carnival and class and colonialism and all of that, I'll just briefly mention a few resources that I've personally found useful. So there's an episode of the You're Dead to Me podcast, which is pretty fun, with Dr. Melissa Ono-George and Nathan Catton. I don't know how to pronounce the name, but anyway, it's on the Notting Hill Carnival in London, which of course started in Trinidad and Tobago and made its way to London, from what I understand. I would also mention a couple, one TV series and one book that are not related, but I'll mention them anyway. There's a TV series called Small Axe by Steve McQueen, which looks into London's West Indian community between 69 and 82, and it's based on real events. And I also mentioned a book called The Black God's Drums by P. Jelly Clark. I'll include all of this in the blog post and descriptions, folks. Which is set on the streets of New Orleans and reimagines a post-Confederacy American South, but not the actual post-Confederacy American South. And I actually don't remember if in the book, because I read it like a couple of years ago, I don't remember if they mentioned Carnival. I just remember having that image in mind. I guess like New Orleans, and there is an explicit mention between dance and class, and I just had this thing in mind. So I'm just mentioning these three. So anyway, putting that aside, Trinidad and Tobago has this obviously special place in Carnival history. In the video description, in your video on that, you write, and I quote, "The history of Carnival in Trinidad is particularly fascinating as it fuses culture and class in a uniquely Caribbean context where colonialism's impacts continue to reverberate today," end quote. So can you tell us just a bit about it? Like, what is the link between Carnival, class, and colonialism?
Yeah, I think that really ties into something you mentioned earlier on discussions between anarchists and the need to not just look at the global sort of context, but also the specific, cultural context taking place. Because upon taking into the history of Carnival and stuff, I think, there are aspects of it that we can really draw from, because Carnival was rebellion, Originally it was brought over by the French aristocracy and bourgeois sort of class, and the enslaved were not allowed to participate in it. But after the end of slavery, the enslaved reclaimed it, and then they also added some seasoning to it. So they added the sort of West African music and instruments and that lyricism and different costumes and folklores and so on. So it went from being a gate-kept upper class affair to being a lower class rebellion. There'll be lyrics about the rulers at the time, criticizing and cajoling them, and occasionally folks would be fetting on the streets and stuff, playing Carnival, and they would clash with the police and military and whatnot. There would be, on a couple different occasions, riots that took place, most notably the Camberley riot. And it's all stuff I go into in the video, but I also see how the Carnival was eventually co-opted by the middle and upper class, and now all the Carnival bands and stuff are basically owned by the 1%. So I've seen through history how it went from being gate-kept to being a rebellion to being claimed and packaged and sort of a touristy way. And so Carnival in the Sri Lankan context has had a major role on and influences and has influenced our views on class and race and gender and other politics.
Thanks for that. I found this really fascinating. It just so happened I had listened to that You're Dead to Me episode that I mentioned. It's just a nice history podcast I enjoy. But the episode on the Notting Hill Carnival started, so they didn't focus only on Notting Hill. They started actually in Trinidad and Tobago. And so I didn't know some of these things that you mentioned, or most of these things that you just mentioned. I found it very interesting how there was a very rapid, on the part of the authorities, of the colonial authorities, desire to crush it. This thing that they really, even some of the quotes that you mentioned, and you read them with a sort of like a old school white colonial voice, which was very funny. But yeah, it's always more revealing than not, isn't it? Like, it's always what are these things that they feel end up, what are these things that they actually threatened by? Yeah,
it's a distinct hatred for liberty, for freedom, for unapologetic, unrepentant culture and expression, because colonial project can't be allowed to just be, part of colonization is the colonization of the mind.
Yeah. And
if you have this opportunity for them to just really express themselves and stuff, they might assume that means that they should be treated as an equal, as a human, if they have that range. They might see that in their collective power They can do a lot more, which is how it ended up being sort of co-opted, because the government eventually ended up regulating and coming to an agreement sort of with the bands. And so it came under the government purview. And, after we gained independence, it remained, there's a government body that runs Carnival. And as such, what was once a bold declaration that, we cannot be crushed, that no matter how much you try to, suppress us, we will continue to express ourselves.
Right, yeah.
We will be free. We will resist your colonization. It ended up, there's a government body that now runs Carnival. And I think what it really shows is that if they couldn't stop the colonized subject from being unabashed and free to express themselves and to resist that suppression of their agency and of their expression, they could at least, try to control it and regulate it, which is exactly what they did. They ended up, bringing it into the system. And I think if there was a conscious effort to keep it outside of the system, we may be in a different situation right now, because Carnival kind of went from a revolt to just a party. It was always a party, but there was that radical element to it, and now it's just something that is run by our rulers, and it's almost like a limited window in which people can catch a break, because a lot of our economy is structured around Carnival. There's the bans from the music industry to the bans and different band releases, and that's a whole other subject, so I won't get too much into that. But it's just very interesting to me how Carnival went from a rebellion against colonialism to part of the package of neo-colonialism and the tourism industry, and went being a way for the working class to express themselves, basically being kept once again by the ruling class due to prohibitive expenses and such.
Right. With all of that in mind, and this has been a very long and fascinating conversation, what are 3 books that you would recommend and why, if that's okay?
Sure, I've recommended this several times before at several different times. I think everybody needs to read it, no matter what part of the world you're from, no matter who you are, I think everybody needs to read The Will to Change, Men, Masculinity, and Love by Bell Hooks. I cried reading that book. It's something that I want to return to ever so often, because it has had such a tremendous influence on my understanding of patriarchy's impact on, men's psyches, a lot of sort of anti-feminist types who don't recognize that, who think that feminists don't recognize the way that men feel in our society, the way that men feel pain and hurt in our society. But I think Bell Hooks addresses it in a way that is not only compassionate, but also doesn't baby the man that she's addressing. Even though she's addressing everybody, she doesn't attempt to soften the severity of patriarchy on non-men, but at the same time, she has this sort of motherly energy to her in her writing, where she's able to reach those men who hurt others, but are also hurt themselves, to sort of dig into themselves and address the impact of patriarchy on themselves and how they're impacting others. Another book I would recommend is The Ecology of Freedom by Murray Bookchin. It is, in my view, one of the most important texts of the 20th century, especially considering the climate situation we're in. I think everybody should read it, whether you count yourself a socialist or not. I think he brings fresh analysis to the situation. And I think that if the environmentalist movement as a whole had picked up this book and had picked it up a lot sooner, I think we'd be in a very different place right now. We might be talking about just adaptation. We might be talking about, actually being able to solve the crisis, I think. Because he wrote this in I believe it was the mid 20th century.
In the 80s.
So there was still some time, the late 20th century. So there was still some time, probably less time than if it had been earlier, but if we had taken some steps to address it now, we might be having a completely different conversation, So I think it's very important for all folks who care about the environment to read. And the last book I would recommend is, of course, Anarchy by Eric Gupta. I think it's just a very good introduction to what I and other anarchists believe. Obviously, it's a very old book. It was written, I think, in the late 19th century, but it's still either late 19th or early 20th century, but it still is very applicable and very relevant today. So, yeah, I would recommend Will to Change by Masculinity and Love by Bell Hooks, The Ecology of Freedom by Mary Buckchin, and Anarchy by Eric Malatesta.
Well, on that amazing note, Andrew, thanks a lot for your time.
Thanks for having me. Really appreciate it.
Fire These Times is made possible by supporters on Patreon. If you'd like to support through a monthly donation, you can head out to patreon.com/firethisetimes. And if you want to explore other options, you can do so by checking out the website.
The Climactic Collective.